The driver didn't speak, just flicked the reins and kept his eyes forward. Evelyn's breath fogged the glass. The world beyond blurred into a gray storm, where fences vanished and the earth itself seemed to fold in on her. She thought of the kitchen she once kept, warm bread, her husband's boots by the door, the soft hum of belonging. It felt like a story she'd borrowed from someone else's life. At the end of the trail rose a wooden gate. Beyond it sprawled a ranch built from strength and solitude, the kind that didn't need company to survive. A man stepped out of the barn, tall and silent beneath a felt hat, his coat hanging heavy with snow. Calder Reeves, she recognized the name whispered with a mixture of respect and fear in town. He'd once been the largest cattle driver east of the divide, until a winter took half his herd and every friend he had. Since then he kept to himself, a mountain of a man who answered no questions and asked none. The wagon halted. The driver climbed down, muttered something about debts paid and left her there, alone at the gate, clutching her small trunk, the snow stinging her cheeks. Calder said nothing. His eyes, a gray darker than the clouds, studied her quietly. Then he opened the gate and walked back toward the barn. She followed because there was nowhere else to go. Inside, the air was thick with the scent of hay and oil. Horses stamped restlessly, steam rising from their flanks. He pointed toward the cabin beyond the corral. "You can stay there," he said at last, his voice rough from disuse. "Water pumps behind it. Wood stacked on the east wall. Don't go near the lower pasture. Ice ain't stable." Then he turned back to his work. Evelyn stood for a moment, the wind wrapping her in its cold arms. She wanted to thank him but could not find the courage. Instead, she nodded and began the slow walk toward the cabin, her boots sinking deep into the drift. The door creaked open to a single room, a cot, a stove, a cracked mirror on the wall. It smelled of pine and loneliness. She set her trunk down, unbuttoned her coat, and exhaled for the first time since morning. The baby shifted beneath her ribs, a reminder that she was not entirely alone. Night fell quick and sharp. Through the frost-blurred window she saw Calder moving between barn and corral, his lantern a slow pulse in the dark. Every motion was deliberate, wordless. She wondered if he pitied her or simply endured her presence. Either way she was grateful. Gratitude was lighter than grief, easier to carry. The next morning she found a pail of milk on her step, half frozen, and a bundle of kindling wrapped in burlap. No note. She brought them inside, set them by the stove, and warmed her hands. The sound of wind outside became a kind of companion, its voice rough but constant. She had no illusions about her place here, a mouth fed out of duty, a burden disguised as charity. Yet even duty could hold a sliver of grace. By the third day she ventured outside to hang laundry. Calder was mending a fence nearby, sleeves rolled to the elbow, breath rising in clouds. She offered a small nod. He returned it with the faintest tilt of his head, then drove another nail. When she dropped a cloth into the snow, he crossed the distance, picked it up, and handed it back without meeting her eyes. Their fingers brushed. Both flinched slightly, not from dislike but from surprise. In a world that had turned its back on them, touch had become a dangerous language. That evening, she overheard the echo of town gossip carried by the wind, voices from the riders passing the trail. "He's taking in another man's shame," one said. "Ain't no surprise, Reeves always did like broken things." Their laughter dissolved into the distance, but the sting remained. She pressed her palm against her belly and whispered, "You'll be better than their words, little one." Later, she brought him supper, stew thickened with flour, all she could make from his sparse pantry. He looked up from his workbench as she placed it down. "Didn't ask for that," he said softly. "I know," she replied. "But I had more than I needed." For a moment, something unreadable flickered in his eyes, maybe respect, maybe sorrow. He nodded once and began to eat. When she turned to leave, he said her name. Just that. Evelyn. It hung in the air, a fragile acknowledgement. No one had spoken it kindly in months. She paused, smiled faintly without looking back, and closed the door. Days stretched thin. Snow deepened. She learned his rhythms, the scrape of boots on the porch, the way he lingered by the window before dawn as if waiting for something that never came. Sometimes she thought she heard him humming beneath his breath, a tune without melody. At night, the wolves howled from the ridge, but she slept soundly knowing he was near. One afternoon she found the fence gate open and followed the prince to the creek. Calder stood there, staring at the frozen water. The sky above was bruised with stormlight. He said quietly, "My wife lies under there. Wagon went through ice 5 years back." He didn't look at her when he spoke. Haven't had reason to talk much since. She felt the weight of his grief settle between them like snow on branches. "I'm sorry," she whispered. "Don't be. You didn't bring the winter." He turned and walked back toward the house, leaving her with the sound of cracking ice beneath her feet. That night, a single lantern glowed outside her cabin. She realized it was his, left burning through the storm. Whether for safety or comfort, she didn't know. But the light steadied her heart in a way prayer no longer could. By week's end, the wind eased. She swept the porch, humming the same wordless tune she'd heard from him. Across the yard, Calder paused from splitting logs, his eyes briefly lifting to meet hers. For the first time he smiled, a faint, uncertain thing like dawn breaking through fog. The world was still cold, the past still cruel, but in that fragile exchange something shifted. She was no longer the woman they threw away, she was the woman who endured. The lantern still burned between their doors, its glow trembling against the snow, waiting for the wind to decide which way the story would turn next. The days that followed settled like snow, quiet, slow, and heavy enough to muffle sound. Evelyn rose before dawn, lighting the stove while the world was still a blue haze outside the window. The cabin creaked with the memory of cold, its timbers expanding as the fire took hold. Across the yard, Calder's shadow passed by the barn door, the lantern swinging in his grip like a heartbeat. Their lives moved in rhythm, though neither would have admitted it. She learned his silence before his kindness. He did not ask questions, nor did he expect answers. Yet each morning, there was a small mercy left behind. Fresh cut wood stacked higher, a jar of preserves on the step, a blanket folded near the chair. He spoke in the language of provision. She, in return, kept his table neat, mended his coat, and swept snow from the porch before his boots reached it. They orbited each other carefully, two wounded souls pretending not to need the warmth that proximity promised. Inside the ranch house, the air smelled of leather, pine resin, and dust. Calder lived in order, everything aligned, everything useful. She began cooking meals there after he found her carrying pots across the yard through the wind. He didn't invite her, he just left the door open. It was enough. She discovered he liked his coffee black and his meat near burnt, that he ate as if it were an obligation rather than pleasure. He said grace every night but never looked up while doing so. Once, she asked if he'd like her to read aloud from the small Bible on the mantel. He shook his head, eyes fixed on the fire. "Words don't change what's been done," he murmured. She didn't press. Yet that night, when she returned to her cabin, she found the Bible placed on her table, the page marked with a folded scrap of paper. The verse read, "And behold, I am with thee in all places whither thou goest." She traced the ink with her finger until the letters blurred. Outside, the town's voices carried faintly through rumor and wind. Mrs. Willard came once a week to check her condition, bringing both medicine and whispers. "They're saying you bewitched him," the midwife chuckled softly. Man like Calder letting a woman take over his stove. Evelyn flushed, embarrassed more for him than herself. She wanted to say there was nothing between them, no touch, no promise, but the warmth that rose in her chest betrayed her. When she told Calder later, expecting irritation, he only said, "Let them talk. Wind's gotta have something to carry." Then he returned to mending a saddle strap, his hands steady. Sometimes she watched him from the window. He worked with the patience of a man who had learned not to rush grief. The way he brushed snow from a horse's mane, the way his shoulders flexed beneath the wool shirt, there was gentleness hidden in his strength, like a bear careful not to break what it protected. She found herself humming again, the tune matching the rhythm of his hammer. One evening, while clearing dishes, she noticed the cuff of his coat torn at the seam. Without thinking, she took it to her cabin and stitched it by lamplight. When he came to the door the next morning, she offered it without a word. He looked at the mended fabric, then at her. His mouth parted as if to speak, but he only nodded. That night, she found the coat folded neatly on her doorstep, a small cedar sprig tucked into the pocket. The scent lingered long after the wind took it. Winter deepened. The nights grew longer, the silence thicker. Evelyn began to feel the weight of the child pressing lower, slowing her steps. Calder noticed. He didn't ask, but one morning he hitched the wagon and left without saying where he was headed. By dusk he returned with sacks of flour, dried fruit, and something wrapped carefully in linen. He placed it on her table, a cradle he'd built himself, sanded smooth, smelling of fresh pine. "It's early," she whispered, unsure whether to cry. "Figure it's good to be ready," he said, rubbing the back of his neck. Then, awkwardly, "Don't know how to make it fancy." She smiled, running her hand along the curved wood. "It's perfect." For the first time, he met her eyes fully, and she saw not coldness but a kind of astonished tenderness, as if he'd forgotten people could thank him. Yet for every step closer, fear followed behind. That night she dreamed of her in-laws, their accusing faces pressing against the window, calling her curse and burden. She woke to the sound of wind battering the shutters and found the lantern outside still burning, his nightly ritual. She wondered if he knew how that light steadied her. A week later, while fetching water, her knees buckled. The bucket fell, spilling across the snow. Calder was there before she could call out, arms catching her just as she fell forward. The cold of his coat met the heat of her skin, and for the briefest moment, the world shrank to the sound of his heartbeat. He carried her inside, laid her near the fire, then knelt beside her, uncertain hands hovering. "You all right?" His voice cracked slightly. She nodded, breath trembling. "The baby just moved strong is all." He sat back, exhaling through his nose, and for a long while neither spoke. The silence between them wasn't empty anymore. It hummed with something fragile and alive. That evening, as she rested, he brought her a cup of broth and sat across the room, pretending to mend reins but glancing up now and then. "You're stronger than you look," he said quietly. "Most days I don't feel it," she answered. He gave a small, wry smile. "Feeling don't make it untrue." The wind howled outside again, shaking the shutters. The firelight carved his face into half shadow, half glow, the lines of loneliness softening for once. Evelyn watched him and felt a strange safety blooming in her chest, an ache that wasn't pain but recognition. She realized she hadn't prayed in months, yet this moment felt close to grace. As the storm raged, he rose and checked the door latch, then stood there listening to the wind's roar. "World's got a cruel voice," he said at last. "But sometimes if you listen close, there's quiet underneath it." He looked back at her, eyes reflecting the fire. "That's where peace hides." Then he turned away, stepping into the night to tend the horses. She lay awake long after, staring at the cradle's pale curve in the lamplight. His words lingered like warmth in her bones. Outside, she could hear him whistling softly through the wind, a lonely tune tender as it was rough. When morning came, she opened her door to find a trail of boot prints leading from his porch to hers. The snow had fallen all night, yet those prints remained perfectly clear, untouched by the wind, as if the storm itself had chosen not to erase them. She stepped out barefoot, one hand on her belly, and followed them halfway before stopping. The sun was rising, gold over white, and in the distance Calder turned at the sound of her door. Their eyes met through the breath of cold air between them. Neither spoke, but both smiled, small, hesitant, true. The quiet of his house was no longer silence. It was a waiting place, holding its breath for what might yet come. And somewhere in that fragile pause, winter began to change its mind. The sky broke open that morning, silver with thin rain and rumor. Evelyn stood by the wagon while Calder hitched the team, his broad shoulders bent under the pale wash of dawn. It had been nearly 2 months since the storm that sealed their quiet bond, and still they spoke little. But the town waited for proof of their odd companionship, and proof has a way of finding its own path. She'd sewn a shawl tight around her belly, though the child's shape was now impossible to hide. The road to town was long and unkind. The wheels sank deep into thawing mud, the horses snorting clouds into cold air. Calder drove without comment, eyes fixed forward, hands steady. Evelyn tried to think of the errands ahead, flour, salt, thread, but her stomach twisted with another hunger entirely, the dread of faces. When they arrived, the street was already alive with the slow hum of gossip. Women stood beneath awnings pretending to shop. Men leaned against posts pretending to rest. Every head turned. She stepped down, her boots landing in puddles that mirrored the gray sky. Calder handed her the list, his fingers brushing hers, just long enough to steady her breath. Inside the general store, the air smelled of flour, lamp oil, and judgment. Mrs. Pickett, the shopkeeper's wife, looked up from behind the counter, her lips curving not into a smile but a line sharp enough to cut. "Well, if it isn't Mrs. Marrow," she said, emphasizing the was. "Didn't expect to see you walking proud these days." Evelyn placed the coins on the counter with trembling fingers. "I need sugar, flour, and kerosene." Mrs. Pickett poured each measure slow as molasses, watching the pregnant belly before her as though it might spill scandal on the floor. "I heard Calder Reeves took you in out of charity," she said sweetly. "That man's got a kind heart. Shame some folks take advantage." Evelyn looked her in the eye, steady now. "He's been nothing but decent." "Decent?" The woman laughed softly. "Honey, men like him don't bring strays home unless they're lonely or guilty." The room tilted, air thickened. Evelyn gathered her goods and turned to leave, but the woman's voice followed like a burr. "You best keep that baby quiet when it's born. Some folks got delicate ears for sin." Outside, the cold bit deep, but Calder's presence steadied her. He said nothing, just took the sack from her hands and loaded it into the wagon. She wanted to tell him everything that had been said, wanted to see the fire she imagined in him, but when she looked up, he was already scanning the sky, his jaw tight. "We're done here," he said simply. They made the ride home in silence. The world seemed to echo with unspoken things. The creak of the wagon, the snap of reins, the muted cry of crows overhead. When the ranch came into view, she finally spoke. "They think I'm a stain on your name." Calder's grip on the reins tightened. "Their talk don't feed cattle, don't chop wood. Let it rot where it starts." "It hurts though," she whispered. He turned toward her, eyes softening. "Then don't carry it. Let me." That night she couldn't sleep. The words clung like smoke. From the window she saw the lantern on his porch flicker, a steady, stubborn light. The next morning she found a folded paper beneath the milk pail. In his rough handwriting it read, "Wine forgets what it says. So should you." She smiled despite the ache. Still, tongues do not rest. A week later, Mrs. Willard came by under pretense of checking her swelling feet but stayed to sip tea and gossip. "Town's turned ugly, child," she sighed. "They say he's keeping you here till the baby's born, then sending you away. They say you cast spells in his barn." Evelyn laughed quietly. "If I had that power, I'd silence half the county." The older woman chuckled, then grew solemn. "You're making him human again, whether you mean to or not. That frightens people more than witchcraft ever could." That afternoon, Evelyn saw Calder riding back from town, his horse flecked with mud, face shadowed by his hat. He carried supplies but also something else, a weight she couldn't name. When he unloaded, she noticed the scrape on his cheek. "Someone say something?" she asked. He shrugged. "Men talk big till you look at them." She reached for a cloth, dipped it in water, and wiped the blood away. "You shouldn't fight for me," she murmured. "Didn't," he said. "Fought for quiet." As winter began to loosen its hold, the first thaw brought visitors. 2 riders, Calder's old acquaintances from the cattle drive years, stopped by for supper. They ate around the long table, laughter echoing for the first time in months. Evelyn served stew and bread, smiling faintly as their stories filled the air. But beneath the humor she sensed something brittle, a curiosity sharpened by drink. "So," one man drawled, "this the woman folks been whisperin' about? Heard you gone soft, Calder." The other chuckled. "Soft ain't the word. Man used to wrestle bulls, now he's tendin' cradles." Calder's expression didn't change. "World's full of things worth tendin'," he said. The words hung heavy, even the fire seemed to pause its crackle. The visitors shifted, uneasy. When they left, Evelyn noticed the smallest ghost of a smile on his face, a silent rebellion against every word thrown his way. Later that night, she stood by the window watching him repair the fence under the moonlight. Each hammer strike sounded like defiance. She realized then that his silence wasn't weakness, it was armor. Where others shouted, he endured. And somehow that endurance had become her shelter. But shame is a patient visitor. One morning while she walked to the well, she overheard 2 women passing by the trail. "She's playing wife till he tires of her," one said. "Then she'll be back begging on church steps." The other laughed. "If the Lord wanted her forgiven, he'd have taken that baby by now." Evelyn's knees gave way before she reached the door. Tears came hot and fast. She pressed her forehead to the cold wood of the barn, praying not for mercy but for strength. Hours later, Calder found her there, red-eyed and trembling. He didn't ask why. He just offered his gloved hand. "Come inside," he said. "The wind's turning." When she hesitated, he added, "You're not leaving here. Not now, not later." Inside, the stove glowed faintly. He poured her a cup of coffee, dark and bitter. "I can't stop what they say," he continued, voice low. "But I can make sure you got a roof, a name, and a place no one can take." She stared into the fire, her breath catching. "A name?" He nodded. "Mine if you want it." She looked up sharply, heart pounding. He wasn't smiling. There was no romance in his tone, only a rough honesty, as if he'd decided something days ago and simply waited for her readiness to meet it. "You do that, for appearance?" she whispered. He met her gaze. "For peace." The silence after stretched long and tender. Snow began to fall again, thick and soundless. She reached for his hand, not to accept yet, not to refuse, but to anchor herself in the truth of his warmth. His fingers tightened slightly around hers. Outside, the wind shifted, carrying with it the distant murmur of the town. But inside that small house, it sounded far away, as though the valley itself had drawn a curtain around them. When the fire dimmed, he rose to add more wood. For a moment, the flame caught his face, The same man who once lived only in shadow now standing in a light he'd quietly chosen. Evelyn's heart ached with something too new to name. By dawn, the snow had covered the world again, soft and unbroken. The gossip would return, of course, it always did. But so would spring. And in the hush before sunrise, she knew the next words spoken in town would no longer wound her. They would only prove how far she had risen above them. Still, as she looked toward the faint outline of the sleeping town beyond the hills, she felt a shiver that wasn't from cold. Change, she realized, was coming, not whispered this time but loud as thunder. The blizzard came without warning, rolling down from the mountains like a living thing, white, howling, merciless. Calder had seen storms before, but none that came this fast. The wind clawed at the shutters, rattling nails loose from the beams. Inside the cabin, Evelyn stirred the pot of broth with trembling hands, her belly round and tight beneath her dress. The air smelled of smoke and fear. "It's early," she whispered, though the ache deep inside her said otherwise. Calder shut the door against the storm and crossed to her. "You should lie down," he said, voice rough with worry. She shook her head, clutching the table for balance. "I can't. Not yet." Another wave of pain rippled through her, sharp as lightning, stealing her breath. He caught her before she fell, guiding her toward the cot. Her fingers gripped his arm, nails digging through his sleeve. "It's time, Calder," she gasped. He froze only a heartbeat before moving. The nearest help was miles away, and the snow had buried every trail. "Hold on," he muttered, pulling on his coat. "I'll get Mrs. Willard." She reached for him, panic in her eyes. "You'll never make it." But he was already out the door, swallowed by white. The storm cut like knives. Each breath burned his lungs, each step sank to the knee. The horse balked at the wind, eyes rolling white, but Calder pushed on, muscles screaming. The midwife's cabin lay across the ridge, too far, too cold, but he refused to turn back. Behind him, Evelyn's cries carried faintly through the storm, each one spurring him forward. When he reached Mrs. Willard's door, he was half frozen, face raw, beard crusted with ice. He didn't knock so much as collapse against the frame. "Evelyn," he rasped. "Now." The woman took one look at him and moved faster than he thought possible. Minutes later, she was bundled on his horse, following him back into the white blur. Inside the cabin, the world had shrunk to the sound of Evelyn's breathing, ragged, shallow, determined. Sweat glistened on her forehead despite the cold. Calder knelt beside her, hands clumsy but steady, while the midwife barked orders. "Boil water. Tear those sheets. Keep the fire alive." He obeyed without thought, his great hands trembling as he poured, tore, fed the flames. Hours passed in a fevered blur. The wind screamed outside, but inside was a rhythm of pain and courage. Her body racked, his soul breaking with every cry he couldn't ease. He whispered her name when she thought she couldn't bear another contraction. "You've done harder things," he said softly. "You've survived worse." Between the pains, she looked at him with eyes full of exhaustion and faith. "Don't leave," she whispered. "Not again." He didn't know what she meant, but he nodded. "Never." When the child finally came, dawn was breaking, pale gold through a world of white. The storm had passed, leaving silence so deep it rang in their ears. The baby's cry shattered it, raw and miraculous. Calder stood frozen as Mrs. Willard cleaned and wrapped the infant, her hands quick and practiced. Then she placed the bundle into Evelyn's trembling arms. "A daughter," she said, smiling tiredly. "Strong little thing." Evelyn wept, the sound soft and full. "She's warm," she whispered, pressing her lips to the tiny forehead. Calder watched, unable to move. Something in his chest, something buried for years, cracked open. When Evelyn looked up, he was still standing by the hearth, one hand gripping the mantel as though the world had tilted. "Do you want to hold her?" she asked. He hesitated, then nodded. The baby was lighter than he imagined, fragile yet fierce, her fists clenched against the cold. She blinked up at him with eyes like early spring sky, blue-gray, uncertain but bright. Calder's breath hitched. He had held dying men, frightened calves, the weight of loss itself, but never life so small and unguarded. "Welcome," he murmured, voice breaking. Evelyn smiled faintly. "She looks like you." He laughed under his breath. "Then she'll be trouble." Mrs. Willard gathered her things as the sun rose higher. "You'll both be fine now," she said, glancing between them. "But keep her warm. She's got her father's stubbornness already." Calder opened his mouth to correct her, then stopped. The word father didn't sting the way he expected. It settled instead, like truth finding its home. When the midwife left, the silence returned, softer this time. Evelyn lay half asleep, the baby nestled against her. Calder sat nearby, the firelight gilding his face. He studied them as if afraid they might vanish if he looked away. "You should rest," he said. She smiled weakly. "You should too." Outside, the snow began to melt from the eaves, dripping like slow clock ticks. Time, it seemed, had decided to move again. He rose quietly, checked the horses, then returned to find the baby stirring. Evelyn was still asleep, her hand resting over the cradle he'd built. He crouched beside it, touching the edge lightly. "Didn't think I'd be any good at this," he whispered. The infant's tiny fingers caught one of his, gripping tight. For the first time in years, Calder Reeves felt seen. Days passed, marked by the rhythm of feeding, tending, resting. He built a shelf for her blankets, patched leaks in the roof, and repaired the cradle's loose hinge. Evelyn regained strength slowly, her laughter returning like the first green under thaw. Sometimes he caught himself watching her, not with desire but with reverence. She carried a quiet power that shamed every cruelty he'd ever heard spoken against her. The gossip reached them even here. Mrs. Willard brought news from town. Talk of illegitimacy, of Calder's supposed weakness, of the witch woman who'd bewitched a rancher into keeping her. Calder listened, jaw tightening, but said nothing. Later, when Evelyn asked if it bothered him, he shook his head. "Let them choke on their words," he said simply. "They'll find no room for breath once they see what we built." Spring crept down from the mountains. Snow gave way to streams, the land began to live again. Evelyn would sit on the porch, the baby swaddled against her chest, watching Calder mend fences. Sometimes he'd look up, catch her smiling, and forget to hammer the next nail. But peace, like weather, never lasts unchallenged. One evening, as they sat by the fire, a rider appeared at the edge of the property, dark coat, familiar posture. Evelyn stiffened. Calder's expression hardened instantly. It was one of her in-laws, face pale from the cold and pride. The man didn't dismount. "We heard she birthed a bastard," he called, voice slicing through the dusk. "We'll take the child. She'll be raised proper." Calder stepped forward, every inch of him calm, lethal. "You'll turn that horse around," he said quietly. "And you'll never ride back this way." The man spat. "You think you can keep what ain't yours?" Calder's hand rested on the gate latch. "I keep what was given. That's the difference." The wind shifted, carrying the scent of rain. The man hesitated, eyes flicking toward the house, where Evelyn now stood in the doorway, the baby in her arms. "She belongs with family," he hissed. "She's got one," Calder said, his voice a low thunder. The rider left without another word, but his threat lingered in the air like smoke. Evelyn stepped beside Calder, clutching the child close. "They'll be back," she whispered. "Maybe," he said. "But they won't find the same man waiting." That night, neither slept. The baby dreamed softly between them, the cradle rocking to the rhythm of the storm beyond the window. Evelyn reached out, her hand brushing his arm. "You didn't have to fight for us," she murmured. "You didn't have to come back through that blizzard." He turned to her, eyes reflecting the fire's glow. "Didn't feel like choice," he said. "Felt like breathing." For a long moment, the only sound was the crackle of wood. Then the baby stirred, her small cry cutting through the quiet. Calder lifted her gently, his massive hands cradling the tiny form as though she were made of glass. "She's got lungs like her mother," he said, smiling faintly. Evelyn laughed softly, the sound fragile but alive. Outside, the storm began again, not snow this time but rain washing the land clean. The scent of earth rose through the cracks in the walls. Calder looked at the two of them, the flicker of fire painting them in amber light, and something inside him whispered that this was no punishment, it was salvation disguised. He stayed by the cradle long after they slept, watching the shadows move across the floor. The child shifted, sighing as if dreaming of sunlight. Calder brushed her cheek with one finger. "You'll never be unwanted," he promised. And as the wind rattled against the walls, a distant thunder rolled over the horizon, not of storm but of horses. Change was coming again, and this time he would be ready for it. The first thaw of spring came with trouble. The creek, swollen from melting snow, roared louder than a herd in stampede. Calder felt it in his bones, the world shifting, softening, waking up after too long a sleep. Evelyn hung laundry in the new sun, the child bundled on her hip, her hair catching gold in the light. Peace looked good on her. But peace never stayed long in this valley. He noticed the riders first, 3 shadows at the far ridge, motionless against the pale horizon. Strangers at a glance, but their stance was too familiar, their silence too heavy. He knew before they descended who they were, her in-laws come back for what they'd called theirs. He said nothing to Evelyn, only handed her the child and told her to go inside. Lock the door, he said. No matter what you hear. The riders came slow, deliberate. Mud splashed under hooves, the scent of wet earth rising with every step. When they reached the gate, the eldest, her late husband's brother, leaned on the saddle horn. You've had your charity, Reeves? He called. We've come for the woman and the babe. The family wants what's rightful. Calder didn't move. Ain't nothing rightful about sending her out to die, he said. The man sneered. You think she belongs to you now? She's in wearing a dress. We won't leave without her. Calder's hand rested lightly on the gate latch. Then you best make peace with the road you'll ride after this. The man's smile faltered. Behind him, one of the others spat into the mud. You talk big for someone hiding behind another man's wife. The word struck like a stone, but Calder's calm didn't break. She's no man's possession, he said evenly. But she's under my roof. And that makes her mine to protect. The wind picked up, tugging at his coat. The horses shifted uneasily, sensing the tension. A long silence stretched between them, broken only by the creek's wild murmur. Then the eldest dismounted, boots sinking deep into the thaw. I'll take her myself, he said, hand resting on his revolver. Calder didn't reach for his own. Instead, he stepped forward, the gate creaking open with a slow, heavy sound. You can try, he said quietly. For a moment, even the birds seemed to hush. Then the man lunged, drawing his gun. Calder moved faster. Years of hard labor made his body swift in ways prideful men forgot. He struck the pistol aside, the blow echoing like thunder. The weapon fell into mud. A horse reared, shrieking. The two other men reached for their belts, but Calder's voice cut through the chaos. Don't. It wasn't shouted. It was colder, heavier, a tone that didn't need volume to command. The brother froze, mud dripping from his jaw. You'll regret this, he spat. Calder's jaw tightened. Already have, a long time ago. Then he turned away, not toward them but toward the cabin where Evelyn stood in the doorway, pale but steady. She held the baby close, eyes wide with fear and something else, faith. The riders mounted and left without another word, their silhouettes swallowed by the rising fog. The valley fell quiet again, though the quiet now had weight, as if the land itself had exhaled relief. Calder walked back toward the porch, mud streaking his boots, shoulders sagging. Evelyn met him halfway. They'll come again, she whispered. Not if they believe what they saw, he said. And if they do, his gaze lifted to the distant ridge. I'll be ready. That night, the rain returned, soft and steady. Evelyn sat by the fire, the child sleeping in her arms. Calder patched a hole in the roof, though the drip had long since stopped. She watched him, the lamplight tracing his rough features, the faint scar near his temple, the gentleness hidden in his heavy hands. When he finally set his tools down, she spoke softly. You didn't have to fight for me. He looked up, the firelight reflecting in his eyes. Wasn't a fight, he said. Was a choice. He hesitated, then added, I don't regret it. Her breath trembled. Even with the town against us? He shrugged. They talk because their lives are empty. Ours ain't. The words landed like warmth in her chest. The baby stirred, letting out a soft cry. Evelyn rocked her gently, humming a lullaby from memory. Calder listened, elbows on his knees, head bowed. She'll need a name, he said after a moment. Something strong. Evelyn smiled. You pick it. He frowned slightly. Names stick longer than fences. You sure? She nodded. You've carried us this far. Let her carry your choice. He thought for a long while. The fire popped softly. Then he said, Grace. She's what neither of us deserved. Evelyn's eyes shone, and she whispered it once as if to test its weight. Grace. The baby sighed in her sleep, the name already fitting like a blessing. For a time neither spoke. Outside, the rain slowed, and the sound of dripping water became the heartbeat of the house. Calder rose, walked to the window and looked out at the land, mud, fence lines and pale buds breaking through soil. He had lived years chasing profit and reputation, only to find peace in what the world had thrown away. Behind him, Evelyn's voice broke the stillness. You built more than a home here, she said. You built a place where the hurt can rest. He turned, meeting her gaze. You think I fixed something? She smiled softly. No. I think you just stopped running long enough to let something good find you. He walked toward her then, slow and unsure. The space between them had always been careful, sacred in its distance. But now it closed like dusk settling. He crouched beside her chair, his rough hand brushing the child's tiny fingers. Never thought I'd thank the men who sent you here, he said quietly. But I do. She reached up, touching the edge of his jaw, a gesture as light as snowfall. They sent me as punishment, she murmured. You turned it into mercy. He caught her hand, pressing it gently against his chest. You gave me back a reason to breathe. His voice cracked just once before steadying again. The fire flickered, painting their faces gold. Outside, the storm finally broke apart, the clouds drifting west. A breeze carried the scent of wet cedar through the open window. Evelyn rose, laying the baby in her cradle, then turned back to him. Spring's coming early, she said. He smiled faintly. Feels like it's been waiting on us. They stood together by the window, watching the first hint of dawn touch the hills. The valley glowed soft and silver, the world born new again. Calder wrapped his arm around her, tentative at first, then certain. She leaned into him, eyes closing, exhaustion giving way to peace. The baby stirred, murmuring as if echoing the wind outside. Calder looked down at the cradle, the small life that had rewritten his own. She's the treasure I never asked for, he said, voice barely above a whisper. Evelyn turned toward him, smiling through quiet tears. No, she said. She's the treasure you were meant to find. The fire dimmed to embers, the sky deepened to rose, and the ranch breathed with the warmth of a new season. For the first time in years, Calder Reeves wasn't alone. He'd built walls to keep the world out and found somehow that love had slipped in through every crack. And as the first bird called from the ridge, the old silence, the one that once haunted the house, finally broke into song.